So now let's talk about manifestations of harassment, the different types and kinds and the ways it can appear. I want to draw your attention right now to FAA medical exams, and once again point out that there are two handouts that you can download. One of them is a handout that I made about 10 frequently asked questions about your FAA medical exam, because I'm still hearing reports, both from men and women, about inappropriate examinations that are not required by the FAA, including breast exams, vaginal exams, and prostate exams or rectal exam, not required under most circumstances. And so it's pretty disturbing. And the FAA wants to know about it. So there's a way, in my handout, there's a way that you can report somebody who's doing something that is not appropriate. Okay, as we talk about harassment, let's start with what's not harassment. This is kind of a short list, actually. So anything that's mutually welcome. When all parties are together, agree, and are happy with what's going on, that's not harassment. If there's reciprocal interest in flirting, and of course, consensual sexual activity between adults, of course, is not harassment. Another aspect about harassment that's important to note is that anybody can be the harasser or the target. Anyone from any age, race, gender. It can be a coworker, employee. It can be the supervisor, business owner, your passenger, client, or student. And the target can be one person, or it can be an entire category of people. And you'll see this coming up in the examples that I have. Microaggressions, some of them fall under the category of just being rude, and it can be intentional. It can be also unintentional. But it doesn't mean, even if it's unintentional, it doesn't mean that harm's not being done. Because microaggressions are commonplace daily insults and indignities. And so it ends up feeling like death of by a thousand cuts. So these are some of the phrases that some of us hear on a regular basis that represent a microaggression. So they see a woman and they say, another empty kitchen. Or someone where they can't discern what their race or ethnicity is. And they go, where are you from? New Jersey. No, really, where are you from? It's incredibly insulting and demeaning to say that. And it's very rude and insulting to ask a Black person, can I touch your hair? Judging women by their attractiveness, not appropriate. Labeling someone in a way that doesn't match their gender identity, it can be, like I say, it can be unintentional, but it can still be harmful. We get this a lot, women do, and others. When we hear expressions of astonishment or disbelief that you can be a pilot. Yes, we can. And this is also a common one where they mistake people for being in a different, lower level job role. We hear quite a bit about women airline pilots and people of color who are airline pilots being mistaken for other roles. Gate agent, bag handler, flight attendant. Or someone comes up onto the flight deck and they look at the man in the pilot seat and address the man as if he's the captain, even though the woman is sitting in the left seat, which is the captain's seat. Racial harassment is race-based put-downs, and they're intended to intimidate, insult, demean, bully, threaten, reject people. And it can be about an individual or collectively. This includes calling people derogatory names, making comments, jokes, crude terms, threats, slurs, or remarks about a certain class of people not being capable of being a pilot or being a competent pilot, or making remarks that they only got hired because of their minority status. And there are remarks that subtly send the message, your kind don't belong here. Display of offensive imagery, including nooses, is harassment. Sexual harassment, and I want to pause here before we get into what's on the screen, and there's a little bit of a fork in the road right here. And this is as a result of my talking to a lot of women and doing research. There are quite a few experiences that women have that are where they're addressed in a derogatory way or a demeaning way, put downs, and you say it's sexual harassment, and they go, well, but you know, it wasn't about sex. So I'm going to use the term gender harassment for the put downs and sexual harassment for the come-ons. They're both sexual harassment because it's both about someone's gender. So on this slide, I'm talking about sexual harassment, the come-ons, that's about sex. And the definition is unwanted, unreciprocated sexual attention. So unwelcome statements, including via texts and social media messages, sending sexual images, unwelcome requests for sex, coercion by requesting sex in exchange for hiring, promotion, or a favorable job report, or for example, passing a check ride. That's known as quid pro quo. Repeated requests for sex despite consistent refusals. Someone who won't stop when asked, and also threats of retaliation. If you don't have sex with me, ... All is sexual harassment. So gender harassment, as I just explained, has a different feel to it. So sexual come-ons are sexual harassment, and here we're talking about gender-based put-downs. And I make this notion because it's like putting you under my thumb by giving you a put-down. So very similar to harassment that people of color experience and other minority groups experience. It's a put-down. It's intended to intimidate and insult and demean, bully, threaten, and reject women individually and collectively. Examples. I have a lot of examples coming up. So this would include anti-female or offensive derogatory names, comments, jokes, crude terms, and slurs. I want to offer one example. And I do apologize, I may use some terms that are offensive terms. So I just wanted to give you that warning. So this actually happened to me. I was an airline pilot in a different airplane than I'm in now, and I was a first officer, and that does make a difference because I was in the lower end of the power disparity with this captain. And we had a checklist, and we use a checklist call and response. I make the call out, in this case, as the first officer, and the captain makes the response, and it's scripted. And the call out was ignition. The response is continuous. But when I made the call out ignition, he made the response continuous. That's one example of what I'm talking about here. Other examples, offensive gestures, leering. I have heard from women where instructors looked at them and made a comment about their beautiful breasts, or looked at them and made a comment about, you could use some implants. Not appropriate. That's harassment. Display of sexual imagery or pornography is also gender harassment. Here's some more. So I did already offer a couple examples of what we're talking about here on the screen. So derogatory remarks or images about women and bodily appearance. Also about bodily functions, menstruation, pregnancy, breastfeeding, and maternity policies. I'm going to pause there to say, women hear a lot of comments about, can you fly that, with that big pregnant belly, for example. And they're completely ignoring how there's some men out there who've got some pretty big beer bellies. They're able to fly, but they don't get these comments. The pregnant woman does. Also comments about the next one, parental status and fitness as a parent. There have been women who are mothers who get comments about, you belong at home taking care of your children. How can you be out here on this 3-day trip? You're neglecting your children. Very rude and extremely inappropriate, and it's harassment. And again, comments about getting hired because of their gender's minority status. I've been a pilot for 39 years. I've been hearing this the entire 39 years, that I only got this job because I'm a woman. Pretty sad. Again, comments about not being capable or competent pilots, that we don't belong in aviation, or that we don't belong in aviation leadership positions. There is a spectrum of people of gender identity, and people in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community also experience harassment. I want to give a shout out now. I forgot to give it. Let me pause for a moment. I forgot to give a shout out earlier that I wanted to make about when I mentioned racial harassment, but it applies to all of this. And I want to give a shout out to two organizations right now. One of them is the Organization of Black Aerospace Professionals, OBAP. Their website is obap.org. And they, OBAP sponsored a series of 5 town hall meetings conducted virtually in June, and that was in response to the killing of George Floyd. And it addressed very directly and openly the racial inequality and injustice in this country. Those and it was included representatives in aviation from all aspects of aviation. They were tremendous, and they're on the website for you to watch. So I want to give a shout out there. And right now, I want to give another shout out to the National Gay Pilot Association, NGPA. I believe the website is ngpa.org, and they have done also tremendous work in bringing awareness to the issue of harassment of people in the LGBTQ community, and working to train people to speak up and to be advocates and allies. So again, just as others are, people in this community are subjected to harassing put downs, very similar to what I spoke of earlier, but includes, for example, disparaging remarks about gay people, gay sex, gay pride, and remarks again about people in the community not belonging in aviation. There's also intersectional harassment, and what that means is that people hold multiple identities. And as I said earlier, for example, I'm white, female, and brought up in a Christian Protestant tradition. And again, there may be people who are female and Jewish, or they are Black and Latino and gay, for example. So people can be harassed for multiple reasons. I've just listed some of the others there, that these are all aspects. Bullying is unwanted aggressive behavior that's meant to intimidate and cause harm. Some examples are abuse of power, silent treatment, snubbing, ignoring, excluding people, ostracizing people, abusive language, threats, taunting and shaming, but also physical intimidation, cornering somebody, blocking their access or blocking their escape, which brings us to sexual violence, which is a crime. It's defined as unlawful. In the United States, it's defined as unlawful, non-consensual touching and sexual activity, including sexual assault. Rape, attempted rape, dosing someone with date rape drugs or other substances are crimes. Also considered crimes, and it varies state by state and by jurisdiction. Unwanted touching of another person's intimate body parts and any non-consensual fondling, rubbing, groping. It may be a crime as well. This is where we get into a little bit more subtle aspects of harassment and discrimination. So the double standard means that there's one standard for us and another standard for you. When people from a minority group are held to a higher standard of performance, or when their standard of performance, which is very good, is not considered good enough, even when they're outperforming their peers from the majority group. And it can also manifest as giving people unbalanced and unjustified hypercritical performance reviews, such as in training and check rides. And this is where I want to talk about gaslighting. We in this country, I think over the last few decades, cracked down on a lot of harassment, both racial harassment and discrimination, and sexual harassment and discrimination, for example, and making it go underground. That doesn't mean it's gone away. One way it's gone underground is what we call gaslighting. The term gaslighting originates from a movie from 1940 called Gaslight. And in the movie, it's a married couple, and the man wants to get rid of his wife, and he does it by turning down the gaslight a little bit every evening, so it's dimmer and dimmer evening by evening. And then he pretends that he hasn't done this. And so she's trying to crochet or knit, and she's like, I'm having trouble seeing. And he's sitting there with a book, pretending to read, and says, I don't know what's wrong with you. I can see perfectly fine. You must be crazy, trying to drive her mad. So gaslighting now in this context is psychological manipulation to distort the target's perception of reality and undermine their self-confidence. It can be very subtle and sneaky, difficult to discern and difficult to prove. But I want you to pay real attention for these next couple of slides, because this is a pattern that is happening in aviation. And I believe it is these patterns, this pattern, that is affecting a lot of us right now. So some examples: sabotage, setting someone up for failure, and then acting all innocent, pretending like, or acting like, oh, I didn't say that, when they did say it, or oh, I didn't mean it that way. Well, they did mean it that way. And another manifestation is when the targeted person protests and they say, oh, you're just being paranoid, you're crazy. So sabotage is when you covertly set someone up for failure by withholding important information or feeding wrong information. And sometimes it's done in collusion with others. So this is where you saw earlier the statistic about the number of well, I had the men, but what was it? 16% of student pilots are women, but only about 6% of licensed pilots are women. Why are we losing so many women? I don't have the answer, but I think what I've got written on the screen, I think, is one of the answers to it. That women are being driven out, and other people, by the way, not only women, other targeted groups as well. Here's how it's done: fallaciously and relentlessly criticizing the target's performance, in contrast to mild critiques of others with comparable or even worse performance. The target ends up feeling beat up, worn down, confused, frustrated, and they can lose their doubt their perception of reality, lose confidence. Then their performance actually might suffer for real. And then finally it reaches the point where they're called in and talked into quitting, or they're fired. One example, well, I'm giving this example, but I've heard this occurring multiple times. And I'm going to use the example of new hire pilots at an airline. One way that we're being trained right now is in pairs. So it's typically two pilots going through training together as training partners. So two pilots who are new hires and one instructor. And then another instructor. I mean, there may be a series of instructors, and it starts with ground school and then simulator training and so on. And I've heard this from multiple people where they come out of the simulator, for example, and they both did okay, you know, in the simulator for that training session. And then in the debrief, the instructor, you know, looks at, all right, I screwed up this maneuver, but you did it perfectly. You know, why is he saying that? Because people intrinsically see injustice and they see when someone's not being fair. But then here's what happens. Eventually, Mike shuts up. I'm using just the name as an example. But the reason Mike shuts up is because he's just trying to get through this training too. And now Susan's just on around. I'm sorry, Jane. I used the name Jane. So I don't know if you're in aviation long enough, you'll see people leave aviation for this reason right here, in my belief. Another outcome from this can be a failed check ride, where then the person doesn't quit, but they return and keep going. But what's the effect of that? Now they have a failure on their FAA record. Or maybe they do lose their job, but they're able to get another job in aviation. Once again, now they have a job termination on their record. I think this has contributed to the reason we don't see more women and minority race pilots advancing as quickly in aviation, or advancing as high in aviation careers. So here are some of the phrases that are gaslighting. You know, I used the top one, an example already, but here's some others. Oh, now that we're PC, I'm not supposed to say that. So I respect you, okay? Or, gosh, I don't know what you're talking about. Or that doesn't happen anymore. Here, this one I've heard in response to complaints of sexual harassment. I know him and he wouldn't say that. He's a good guy. He's a family man. Why didn't you tell him to stop? That shifts the blame, of course, to the target. Or why do you want to make a complaint? That'll ruin his life. Well, what about the person who was harassed? Isn't this possibly ruining their life? Oh, that's not a big deal. You're just blowing it out of proportion. I'm not going to read all of these, This is gaslighting of someone who has been perhaps a victim of sexual assault. I guess I was mad when I made this slide, or I really want to emphasize this. Ignoring harassment complaints is also harassment. Retaliation for reporting harassment is also harassment. And that contributes to a hostile work environment. What can I do about harassment?